3 years after destroying his marriage, Duke Edmund Hawthorne would see his former wife kneeling in a cottage garden, 2 children laughing beside her, and recognize his own eyes in the younger one. He would stand beyond the fence, unable to speak, while the life he had cast away bloomed before him. But on the morning his story with Eleanor Vale began, neither of them could imagine such a reckoning. Hawthorne House rose above the green valleys of northern England like something carved from the mountain itself. Its towers caught the pale morning sun. Its windows reflected centuries of portraits, marriages, births, and funerals. Servants moved through its corridors with practiced silence, because in a duke's household even footsteps seemed to understand rank. Edmund understood it better than anyone. At 36, he was respected, wealthy, and feared in the quiet manner of men who never needed to raise their voices. He had inherited the title young, along with acres of land, political obligations, and a family expectation that pressed against his shoulders like armor. His father had died with one warning repeated until the end. A duke without an heir left more than a title vulnerable. He left a dynasty exposed. Edmund had therefore learned to measure life in duties. Then Eleanor Vale ruined the arithmetic. He first noticed her at a country gathering he had almost skipped. She was not wearing the most expensive gown, nor was she surrounded by admirers. While other guests gathered beneath striped awnings, Eleanor had abandoned the ballroom terrace after hearing a stable boy crying. Edmund followed the sound. He found her kneeling beside the boy, whose palm had been torn by a frightened horse. Eleanor's cream-colored gloves were stained with blood. She was speaking softly, asking him to breathe while she wrapped the wound with a strip torn from her own handkerchief. "You should have summoned someone," Edmund said. She looked up. Her eyes were warm brown, her dark hair loosely escaping its pins, and there was no alarm in her expression at discovering the Duke himself standing before her. "I did," she replied. He was frightened. "I thought kindness might arrive faster." Something shifted inside Edmund. Most people became careful around him. Eleanor became honest. Over the following weeks he found reasons to see her. Their conversations began in gardens and ended beside library windows while rain silvered the glass. They rode across the estate at dusk, when the hills turned violet beneath the setting sun. Eleanor laughed when Edmund tried to appear stern after losing a race on horseback, and he discovered, to his astonishment, that he wanted to hear that laughter again. She never flattered him. Instead she questioned him. Why did he speak to servants as though they were invisible? Why did he never visit the village school? Why did he believe responsibility and happiness had to be enemies? Edmund should have been offended. Instead he began changing. He visited the school. He learned the names of stable hands. He started lingering in the gardens because Eleanor loved roses, even though he had once considered gardening a pointless occupation. One evening, beneath an oak tree glowing with late summer light, he admitted the fear beneath his composure. "I need an heir," he said. Eleanor studied him carefully. "You need a child you can love. Those are not necessarily the same thing." Her words unsettled him because they reached somewhere no one else had dared touch. "I want a family," he said at last. "Then build one," she answered. "Not merely a dynasty. A home." For the first time, Edmund imagined a future that did not feel like an obligation. He proposed before winter. Their wedding was intimate by aristocratic standards, though the estate glittered with candlelight that evening. Eleanor walked toward him in ivory silk, nervous but smiling, and Edmund felt something dangerously close to peace. Later, when the guests had gone, he led her through a moonlit corridor to a small stone cottage standing at the edge of his lands. Ivy climbed its walls and roses crowded the windows. "This is yours," he told her. Eleanor stared at him. "Mine? Always. Whatever happens, you will have a home here." She touched the key he placed in her palm, then looked at him with such trust that Edmund almost felt unworthy of it. "You make promises very solemnly, Your Grace. Only the important ones." She smiled and kissed him. For a little while, Edmund Hawthorne believed love could soften even the hardest inheritance. He did not know that the family legacy he worshipped would one day become the weapon that shattered the woman beside him. Across the ballroom that night, beneath a chandelier bright as ice, Lady Vivienne Ashford watched the newly married couple through half-lowered lashes. Beautiful, polished, and perfectly patient, she lifted her glass without drinking. Her smile was small. She had already decided that Eleanor Vale Hawthorne would not keep the Duke forever. Vivienne understood something Edmund did not. In Hawthorne House, love might open the door, but legacy could decide who remained behind it forever. By the following spring, Hawthorne House had changed in ways Edmund had never thought possible. Eleanor filled its severe rooms with music, fresh flowers, and the warm disorder of ordinary happiness. Servants smiled more readily. Even Edmund, who had spent years believing a duke must never surrender control, began leaving his papers untouched when Eleanor asked him to walk with her beneath the flowering trees. Then she told him she was carrying their child. For one suspended moment, Edmund simply stared at her. "Are you certain?" Eleanor laughed through sudden tears. "Unless you know another reason, I have been fainting every morning." He pulled her into his arms. The man who had spoken of heirs as duty now held the news as though it were a miracle. He kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her trembling hands, and finally whispered against her hair, "Our child." Pregnancy softened Eleanor and sharpened Edmund's protectiveness. He ordered the nursery prepared months ahead of time, and sent for the physician whenever Eleanor complained of the smallest pain. She teased him for hovering. "You are becoming impossible." "I am becoming cautious." "You inspected the nursery curtains yesterday. They were dusty." "They were perfectly clean." Edmund looked solemn. "That is precisely what someone with dust would say." She laughed, and he smiled because he had learned that her happiness was something he wanted to guard. Their son arrived on a morning in early autumn. Arthur Hawthorne entered the world small, furious, and gloriously alive. When the midwife placed him in Eleanor's arms, she wept. Edmund stood beside the bed, unable to speak. Then his son opened dark eyes. Edmund touched one tiny hand with his finger. Arthur closed his fingers around it. Something inside the Duke broke open. He had imagined an heir wearing the Hawthorne name, continuing the family line, inheriting estates and responsibilities. He had never imagined the startling truth that this child could make his heart ache simply by breathing. "He is perfect," Edmund whispered. Eleanor looked at him over the baby's head. "He is ours." Those 3 words became the center of their world. Arthur grew quickly, surrounded by tenderness. Eleanor learned every sound he made, from hungry cries to breathless giggles whenever Edmund lifted him high above his head. Edmund, once uncomfortable around children, became ridiculous with his son. He carried Arthur through the gardens, showed him the horses, and proudly told every visiting relative that the boy had inherited the Hawthorne stubbornness. Eleanor watched them with delight. At night, when Arthur slept in his cradle, she sometimes rested her head against Edmund's shoulder. "Promise me something," she murmured. "What?" "Promise me he will never think love must be earned." Edmund turned toward her. "I promise." Arthur's arrival seemed to settle every uncertainty. Society praised the young duke's fortune. The family celebrated the continuation of the line. Even Edmund's sternest relatives relaxed, convinced that Hawthorne's future was secure. But happiness, Eleanor would later understand, can become frighteningly fragile when too much rests upon it. Arthur's first fever came without warning. One evening, Eleanor noticed that his cheeks were unusually flushed. She touched his forehead and felt heat beneath her palm. "Edmund." He looked up from his desk. There was something in her voice that made him rise immediately. Within hours, the nursery filled with anxious movement. Eleanor held Arthur against her chest while servants carried hot water and fresh linens upstairs. Edmund sent for Dr. Alistair Pembroke, the family physician, whose calm manner could steady an entire household. The doctor examined the child carefully. "It is a fever," he said. "We must watch him closely." "Is he in danger?" Edmund asked. "Not necessarily." The answer should have comforted him. It did not. Arthur's temperature rose during the night. Eleanor refused to leave his side. She cooled his forehead, whispered songs, and counted every breath as though numbers could keep him safe. Edmund stood near the cradle, staring at the tiny face that had transformed his understanding of love. By dawn, exhaustion had hollowed Eleanor's eyes. "Go and rest," Edmund urged. "I cannot. You have been awake all night." "So has he." Edmund had no answer. The following days became a blur of medicine, sleeplessness, and frightened prayers. Arthur would improve for a few hours, then worsen again. Eleanor's devotion became absolute. She ate only when forced, slept in fragments, and kept one hand on her son's blanket even while sitting beside the fire. Dr. Pembroke assured Edmund repeatedly that Eleanor was doing everything possible. Yet fear had begun whispering inside the Duke's mind. He had spent his life believing every danger could be controlled by wealth, discipline, and command. Now he stood helpless beside a child's bed, unable to order death away. On the 7th night, Arthur's breathing changed. Eleanor heard it first. She sprang from her chair and gathered him close. "Edmund," she whispered, terror finally breaking through her composure. "Something is wrong." He rushed to her side. For the first time since becoming a father, the Duke felt completely powerless. And in the silence that followed, his fear began searching for someone to blame. The seventh night stretched toward dawn, cold and breathless. Arthur lay in his cradle, his cheeks burning, his small chest rising with painful effort. Eleanor sat beside him, one hand resting over his blanket, the other gripping the edge of the chair whenever fear threatened to overwhelm her. Dr. Pembroke worked quietly, changing medicines, listening to Arthur's breathing, checking his pulse. Edmund remained near the window, rigid beneath the weight of helplessness. "He is fighting," the physician said. "Then save him," Edmund replied. "I am trying." Eleanor looked at Edmund. "He needs us both." But Edmund barely heard her. His mind had become a locked room filled with the same terrible question. How could his son, the future Duke of Hawthorne, be so ill? Arthur improved briefly the next afternoon. Eleanor smiled for the first time in days when he opened his eyes and reached weakly toward her. "There you are," she whispered. "Mama is here." Edmund watched from the doorway. For one fragile hour, hope returned. Then Arthur's fever surged again. The household physician ordered fresh linens, cool cloths, and silence. Eleanor obeyed everything without hesitation. She slept in fragments beside the cradle, sometimes waking with her cheek against the mattress. Her hair came loose from its pins. Her dresses became creased. She forgot meals unless a servant placed food directly into her hands. Still, Edmund began noticing only what frightened him. Why had Arthur worsened after Eleanor had held him? Why was his wife so exhausted? Why did the child seem calmer when servants attended him? Fear transformed innocent details into accusations. Dr. Pembroke noticed the change. "Your Grace," he said one evening, "Lady Eleanor has done nothing that caused this illness." Edmund's jaw tightened. "I did not accuse her." "You were thinking it." The Duke turned sharply. "You presumed too much. I have treated children for 20 years. Fever is not a moral judgment, and neither is illness evidence of neglect." Edmund said nothing. Then Lady Vivienne Ashford arrived. She came dressed in deep blue, carrying a basket of fruit and flowers, her expression composed with exquisite care. She spoke softly to Eleanor, offered condolences, and praised her devotion. "You must rest," Vivienne murmured. "A mother cannot care for a child if she destroys herself." Eleanor gave a weary smile. "I will rest when he is better." Vivienne's eyes flickered toward Edmund. "How fortunate Arthur has his father," she said. "A man can sometimes remain clear-headed when a mother's heart becomes overwhelmed." The sentence was gentle enough to pass as concern. Edmund heard something else. He began seeking Vivienne's opinion. She never openly blamed Eleanor. She did something more dangerous. She planted questions. Perhaps Eleanor was too emotional. Perhaps she was inexperienced. Perhaps Arthur needed someone stronger. Perhaps a woman so consumed by grief could not make sensible decisions. Each suggestion arrived wrapped in sympathy. Meanwhile, Eleanor fought for her son. One night, Arthur's breathing became shallow. Eleanor ran for Dr. Pembroke herself, crossing the dark corridor barefoot because she had forgotten her slippers. When she returned, Edmund was standing beside the cradle. "Where were you?" he demanded. "I went for the doctor." "You left him." "I went because he was worse." "You should have sent a servant." There was no time. Dr. Pembroke entered moments later and silenced them with a single look. He examined Arthur while Eleanor stood beside him, praying beneath her breath. The next hours were desperate. Near dawn, Arthur's little body finally relaxed. Eleanor smiled, believing the worst had passed. Then Dr. Pembroke lowered his eyes. She understood before Edmund did. "No," she whispered. "I am so sorry." She bent over the cradle. Arthur looked almost peaceful. "He is sleeping," she said. Edmund turned away. For the first time in his life, the Duke could not command himself to remain composed. He walked into the corridor, pressed one hand against the stone wall, and bowed his head. Inside the nursery, Eleanor remained beside her son. She touched his hair. She kissed his forehead. She whispered promises to a child who could no longer hear them. By evening, the estate had become unnaturally silent. Curtains were drawn. Fires burned low. Servants moved like shadows. Eleanor stopped eating. She could barely breathe through it. She stopped speaking unless someone addressed her. She carried Arthur's small blanket from room to room, folding it against her chest as though warmth might remain trapped inside the cloth. Edmund watched her disappear beneath grief. He should have sat beside her. He should have told her they had lost their son together. Instead, his grief hardened into anger. He needed an explanation. He needed someone responsible. Vivienne found him alone in the library that night. You cannot let this destroy the family, she said softly. Edmund stared into the dying fire. He was my heir. I know. He should have lived. Vivienne moved closer. Perhaps, she whispered, you have been asking the wrong question. He looked at her. She lowered her eyes, performing hesitation perfectly. Perhaps the question is not why Arthur became ill, but whether he received the care he needed. Edmund's face changed. Outside the library, unseen by either of them, Dr. Pembroke stood in the corridor with a letter in his hand. He had written the truth days earlier. But Edmund had already begun listening to someone else. For 3 days after Arthur's funeral, Eleanor scarcely left the nursery. The room smelled of extinguished candles, lavender water, and wilted flowers. His cradle remained untouched. His little wooden horse stood beneath the window. Edmund avoided the room. He told himself Eleanor needed solitude. The truth was harder. Her grief reminded him of his own. She had loved Arthur without calculation, while he had loved him as both son and heir. Now the distinction shamed him. Vivienne understood his weakness. She visited him each evening, never speaking directly against Eleanor. Instead, she offered carefully measured observations. Lady Eleanor is not herself. She has suffered, Edmund replied. Of course. But grief can make a person careless. He looked toward the fire. Dr. Pembroke says she did everything possible. Vivienne lowered her gaze. I would never contradict the physician. I only wonder whether a mother so overwhelmed by emotion can recognize what a child needs. The thought took root. Meanwhile, Eleanor emerged from the nursery carrying Arthur's blanket. Her face was pale, her eyes swollen, but she remained composed. Edmund saw her crossing the hall. Eleanor. She stopped. I need to speak with you. She turned slowly. About Arthur? His hesitation was answer enough. She followed him into the drawing room, where several chairs had been arranged in an unforgiving semicircle. Eleanor noticed them immediately. Why are there people here? Edmund did not answer. The doors opened. His mother's solicitor entered. 2 elderly relatives followed. Household members stood behind them. At the far end, Lady Vivienne appeared in mourning black, her expression solemn. Eleanor stared at Edmund. What is this? A necessary announcement. Her fingers tightened around Arthur's blanket. Dr. Pembroke arrived moments later, his expression grave. His gaze moved across the room and settled on Edmund. Your Grace, whatever you intend, reconsider? Edmund's face hardened. I have considered everything. No, the physician said. You have considered your grief. Silence fell. Edmund stepped forward. Arthur is dead. Eleanor flinched as though struck. I know. You were his mother. I was, she whispered. And I loved him. I know you loved him. Then why are you speaking to me like this? Edmund looked at the assembled witnesses. Because love was not enough. Eleanor's eyes widened. Dr. Pembroke moved forward. That is unfair. Edmund ignored him. You spent nights beside him, yes. But you were exhausted. Distracted. Emotional. You made decisions while frightened. I called you. I called the doctor. I never left him except to bring help. You should have done more. Eleanor stared at him in disbelief. What more could I have done? Edmund had no answer. That should have stopped him. Instead, grief drove him past reason. I cannot build the future of Hawthorne upon uncertainty. Her face changed. The future? The family must continue. Eleanor looked down at Arthur's blanket. Our son has been dead for 3 days. And I cannot allow his death to destroy everything. She lifted her eyes. You think I destroyed him. I think you failed him. Dr. Pembroke stepped between them. Your Grace, Arthur's illness was sudden and severe. Eleanor followed every instruction I gave her. You know this. I know what I saw. You saw a mother trying to save her child. I saw a mother who could not save him. The cruelty of it struck deeper because Edmund spoke without anger. Eleanor's lips trembled. Then she straightened. If you need someone to blame, blame me privately. Do not turn our son's death into a spectacle. Edmund's expression remained cold. It is already a matter of public concern. The succession cannot be left uncertain. Vivienne spoke softly. Perhaps there is another way. Eleanor turned toward her. Vivienne's sympathy was flawless. You need time to recover, Eleanor. Perhaps living quietly away from the estate would allow you to heal. Eleanor understood then. This had been arranged. Not merely a separation. An erasure. Edmund reached inside his coat and removed a folded document. I have decided to end our marriage. Eleanor stared at the paper. She remembered the cottage key resting in her palm on their wedding night. She remembered his promise. "Whatever happens, you will have a home here." "You promised me," she said. Edmund swallowed. "I remember. You promised I would always have a place. You will have the cottage." Her laugh was small and broken. "The cottage? It is yours. As consolation? As your home?" Eleanor looked at the man she had once believed understood her. Then Edmund delivered the sentence that would follow her for years. "You cannot raise one child. How could I trust you with the children this family still needs?" The room went still. For a moment, Eleanor could not breathe. She looked from Edmund to Vivienne, then toward the door through which Dr. Pembroke had entered. No one spoke. She understood that her husband had already chosen the story he would tell, and truth would have no place in it. Eleanor's face emptied of color. She placed Arthur's blanket upon a chair. "I see." She removed her wedding ring. Instead, she placed it beside the blanket. Then she walked away. That night, Eleanor entered Arthur's nursery alone. Moonlight spilled across the empty cradle. She touched the mattress where her son had slept and finally allowed herself to sob. Before dawn, she packed a single trunk. At the cottage, she lit the fireplace. Then nausea swept through her. She pressed a hand against her stomach. It came again. Eleanor closed her eyes. She counted the days. Her breath caught. She reached for the calendar with trembling fingers. One truth emerged from the wreckage. She was carrying his child. And Edmund had just told her she could not raise one. The cottage was silent when Eleanor woke the next morning. She did not remember where she was. Then the cold hearth and Arthur's folded blanket returned everything. Her hand moved instinctively to her stomach. A child. Edmund's child. The realization should have filled her with joy. Instead, it frightened her more deeply than anything she had ever known. She had already watched one child die. She could not bear to imagine another life depending upon a world that had rejected her. She returned to Hawthorne House only once, secretly, to collect a few personal belongings. She did not see Edmund. She did not want to. Months later, society learned the Duke would marry Lady Vivienne Ashford. The announcement was received with approval. Vivienne possessed everything society admired: beauty, elegance, impeccable connections, and a talent for making ambition look like refinement. She entered Hawthorne House beneath chandeliers that glittered like frozen stars, wearing diamonds at her throat and a smile that revealed nothing. Edmund believed he had chosen wisely. He told himself that Vivienne was composed where Eleanor had been emotional, practical where Eleanor had been tender, and strong where grief had made his first wife fragile. He did not ask why Vivienne never spoke about Arthur. He did not notice that she admired the estate more than the family. Her first weeks as Duchess were devoted to transformation. She replaced Eleanor's arrangements in the drawing room, ordered new curtains, demanded imported furniture, and complained that the West Wing was insufficiently grand. When she mentioned jewels, he bought them. When she requested horses, he purchased them. When she spoke of renovating the ballroom, he approved the plans. Each expenditure seemed insignificant beside the inheritance he possessed. "I shall give you another heir," she told him one evening. Edmund looked at her with sudden gratitude. "You will?" "Of course." She touched his cheek. "You need a proper family again." The words soothed the wound Eleanor had left behind. Edmund never understood that Vivienne had studied that wound carefully. While the Duke waited for the future, Eleanor built one of her own. Her pregnancy progressed inside the little stone cottage. There were no physicians hovering outside her door, no servants preparing nurseries, no aristocratic relatives offering congratulations. She had only Dr. Pembroke, who visited discreetly and never asked her to return to Hawthorne. "You must eat," he told her. "I am trying. And you must remember that this child has done nothing wrong." Eleanor looked toward the window. "No," she said softly. "This child has done nothing wrong." When her daughter was born, rain whispered against the cottage roof. Eleanor held the tiny bundle against her heart and wept. "Isabel," she whispered. The baby opened her eyes. For one breathless moment, Eleanor saw Edmund in that gaze. Then she kissed her daughter's forehead. "You will never know what it means to be unwanted," she promised. "You will know only that you are loved." Years passed. Eleanor raised Isabel with patient devotion. She taught her letters at the kitchen table, showed her how to plant beans in spring, and sang to her when thunderstorms shook the windows. The cottage became bright with life. Then Thomas Reed arrived. He was 8 years old, thin from hunger and guarded by the hard silence of a child who had already learned not to expect rescue. His mother had died, leaving him with no family willing to take him. Eleanor intended to help him for a few weeks. Isabel had other ideas. "He can stay with us," she announced. "Isabel, Thomas needs more than a spare bed. Then we will give him more." Eleanor looked at the boy. Thomas stood near the doorway clutching a worn wooden toy. He seemed prepared to be refused. "Do you want to stay?" Eleanor asked. He nodded. "Then you may." That simple answer changed the cottage forever. Thomas became Isabel's brother in everything that mattered. He repaired her broken toys, defended her from nettles, and carried baskets too heavy for her small arms. Eleanor watched them grow together and understood something Edmund had never learned. Family was not a possession. It was a promise kept every day. Far away, Vivienne finally received the news she had been waiting for. She was pregnant. Edmund was ecstatic. He ordered bells rung across the estate, sent for the finest physician in London, and began planning another nursery before the first announcement had even been printed. Vivienne smiled as he kissed her hands. Behind the closed door of her dressing room, however, her expression changed. From a hidden drawer she removed a bundle of letters tied with black ribbon. They were from Lord Julian Mercer. She read the newest one, then glanced toward the jewels covering her vanity. The child was useful. The Duke was useful. His fortune was useful. Love had never entered the calculation. Vivienne folded the letter and smiled at her reflection. She had not married Edmund to become a mother. She had married him to become untouchable. And while Edmund believed another heir would restore everything he had lost, Eleanor was raising 2 children in a cottage where neither carried a title. Yet both were learning what the Duke of Hawthorne had failed to understand. One day blood would bring them together. And when that day came, Edmund would discover that the family he had rejected had never stopped growing. Edmund Hawthorne had waited years for the moment when his second marriage would restore the future he believed he had lost. When Vivienne announced her pregnancy, he felt something inside him loosen. An heir. The word had once meant duty. Now it sounded like redemption. He became attentive to Vivienne, arranging physicians, canceling journeys, and placing the nursery beneath constant supervision. He imagined another child filling the corridors with laughter, another small hand closing around his finger. He did not realize that the woman beside him was already planning how to turn his happiness into wealth. Vivienne's pregnancy was difficult only when Edmund was watching. In private, she complained about the restrictions, the servants, and the inconvenience of carrying a child. For a few weeks, Edmund mistook anticipation for peace. He walked through the nursery at night, touching the carved wooden rail of the empty cradle, imagining a future in which no shadow of Arthur remained. Yet whenever he pictured the child, Eleanor's face intruded upon the vision. He would turn away from the thought, insisting that regret was merely another form of weakness. He had not yet learned that some mistakes did not disappear when ignored. They waited patiently for the courage to be named. And somewhere within him, a quieter truth had already begun to stir. He simply did not recognize it yet. One afternoon, she met Lord Julian Mercer in a secluded garden. "You promised me freedom," she said. Julian glanced toward the house. "And you promised me access." "I have access." "To what?" "Everything." Her smile was cold. She had already moved small sums from Edmund's accounts, purchased jewels in her own name, and arranged correspondence with an estate agent in London. The child, she believed, would secure her position even if the Duke discovered the truth. But Edmund discovered it sooner than she expected. He found a letter in her dressing room bearing Julian's seal. He read only the first few lines before his face became expressionless. When Vivienne entered, she stopped. "You should not be reading private correspondence." "Who is Julian Mercer?" She went still. For several seconds neither spoke. Then Vivienne laughed softly. "You truly never suspected?" Edmund's hands tightened around the paper. "Answer me." She removed her gloves. "I married you because you were a duke." The word struck with brutal simplicity. "Did you ever love me?" "No." Edmund looked away. "You said you wanted a family." "I wanted security." "And the child?" Vivienne's expression hardened. The child was useful. Something broke behind Edmund's eyes. He had spent years believing he could identify weakness in others. Now he understood that his own hunger for an heir had made him easy to deceive. Vivienne attempted to leave that night with money, jewelry, and documents. Edmund stopped her before she reached the carriage. He did not shout. That frightened her more. "Go," he said. "Take nothing that belongs to Hawthorne." She stared at him. "You think Eleanor was better?" Edmund flinched. Vivienne smiled bitterly. "You destroyed the only woman who loved you, and you did it because I told you what you wanted to hear." She stepped into the carriage. The wheels disappeared into the darkness. Edmund remained beneath the portico long after the rain began. His second marriage had not merely failed. It had exposed the ugliness beneath his first mistake. He returned to the library and found Dr. Pembroke waiting. The physician held an old envelope. "I should have given you this years ago." Edmund recognized his handwriting on the front. "What is it?" "The truth about Arthur." Dr. Pembroke opened the letter. "I wrote that Arthur's illness was severe, unpredictable, and unrelated to Eleanor's care. I wrote that she had followed every instruction I gave her. I warned you that grief was making you vulnerable to false accusations." Edmund stared at the pages. "Why did I never receive this?" "Because it was intercepted." "By Vivienne?" The physician nodded. Edmund sank into a chair. The room seemed suddenly enormous. He remembered Eleanor standing before him with Arthur's blanket in her arms. He remembered her pleading. He remembered the way she had removed her wedding ring. Most painfully, he remembered his own words. "You cannot raise one child." His voice broke. She was pregnant. Dr. Pembroke said nothing. Edmund looked up sharply. "How do you know?" "I did not know then. I learned later. Eleanor came to me privately after she left. She asked me to keep her condition confidential." Edmund rose. "She has my child." "She had your child." The distinction terrified him. "How long ago?" "Years." Edmund stared toward the rain-darkened windows. For the first time, the inheritance he had worshipped seemed meaningless. His title could not tell him where Eleanor lived. His wealth could not undo a sentence spoken in cruelty. His name could not restore the years he had stolen from a daughter who might never know him. "Where is she?" Dr. Pembroke hesitated. "Living quietly." "Where?" "I promised Eleanor I would not tell you." Edmund closed his eyes. He wanted to command the answer. Instead, he understood that commands were what had destroyed his family. "I have to find her." The physician studied him carefully. "You may find her, Your Grace. But finding her does not mean she will forgive you." Edmund looked at the letter again. "I don't deserve forgiveness." "No," Pembroke said. "But you may still have the chance to become worthy of it." Outside, the rain continued falling over Hawthorne House. Across the countryside, in a little cottage Edmund had forgotten existed, Isabel was laughing while Thomas chased her through the garden. And neither child knew that their father had finally begun searching for them. 4 years had passed since Edmund Hawthorne had last seen Eleanor. Parliament still demanded his attention, tenants still sent letters, horses still needed tending, and Hawthorne House still stood beneath its ancient towers. Yet Edmund moved through his own estate like a visitor. Dr. Pembroke would give him no address. Former acquaintances knew only that she lived somewhere beyond the northern villages. Edmund could have used his influence to force answers, but he had finally learned that some doors could not be opened by command. Then one autumn afternoon he found the cottage. He had been riding through unfamiliar country when he noticed a narrow lane bordered by hawthorn bushes. The cottage, its modest walls, flower boxes, and patched gate seemed painfully ordinary beside the grandeur he had once offered Eleanor. Yet standing there, Edmund sensed more warmth in those humble stones than he had ever felt inside his vast ancestral home. A child laughed. Edmund pulled his horse to a stop. He dismounted and walked toward the garden. Then he saw her. For an instant, the years collapsed, and he remembered the young woman who had once walked beside him beneath summer roses, believing his promises were safe. Eleanor was kneeling beside a wooden planting bed, sleeves rolled above her wrists, her dark hair gathered loosely at her neck. She looked older than the woman he remembered, but not diminished. There was peace in her face now, and a quiet strength that had not existed when she left Hawthorne House. Edmund stopped behind the fence. He had imagined Eleanor furious. He had even imagined her refusing to look at him. A little girl ran through the garden carrying a basket almost too large for her arms. "Mama, I found the carrots." Eleanor laughed. Edmund's breath caught. The girl turned toward the sunlight. Her hair was dark. Her eyes were unmistakably Hawthorne. Edmund gripped the fence. His knuckles whitened as he fought the impulse to rush forward, afraid that one careless movement might frighten away the only proof that his lost family had survived. He knew. "My God," he whispered. The little girl looked toward the gate. Eleanor followed her gaze. Her smile vanished. Edmund stepped inside. "Eleanor." She rose slowly. "You found me." "I did." Then she looked at Isabel. Edmund could barely speak. "Is she mine?" Eleanor did not answer immediately. The girl moved closer to her mother's skirts. Finally Eleanor said, "Her name is Isabel." Edmund swallowed. "Is she my daughter?" "Yes." Eleanor's answer was quiet, but it carried the finality of a door that had once been closed and carefully locked. The single word nearly brought him to his knees. "You have my eyes," he whispered. Eleanor's expression tightened. "She has her own eyes." He understood the rebuke. Behind Isabel, a boy appeared carrying a basket of apples. He was older, perhaps 8, with wind-reddened cheeks and a guarded expression. He stopped when he saw Edmund. "Thomas," Eleanor said quietly, "come here." Edmund looked at him. "And him?" "Thomas Reed. Your son?" Eleanor's gaze softened. "In every way that matters." Thomas watched Edmund carefully. "He is the man from the big house," he said. Edmund felt the words like a blade. "Yes," Eleanor replied. Edmund looked at the two children and understood the irony with devastating clarity. The woman he had declared incapable of raising one child had spent years raising two. "I didn't know," he said. "I should have known. You didn't ask. I was told you were gone. I was gone. I searched. Too late." He lowered his eyes. "I deserved that." Eleanor's voice remained calm. "You deserve the truth." She told him about the pregnancy, the fear that had followed, and the lonely night when she first understood that the child within her would have only one parent willing to stay. Edmund listened without interruption. When she finished, he looked at Isabel. The child had been listening quietly, her small face solemn as she tried to understand why this stranger carried so much sadness. "May I speak to her?" Eleanor hesitated. Finally she nodded. Edmund crouched several feet away from the child. "Hello, Isabel." "Hello. My name is Edmund." "I know." He smiled sadly. "Do you?" "Mama told me." "What did she tell you?" Isabel considered him. "That you were once a good man who made terrible choices." Edmund closed his eyes briefly. Then Isabel asked, "Are you the man Mama used to love?" The question shattered what remained of his composure. He looked at Eleanor. She stood silently beneath the autumn trees, no longer the frightened young woman he had cast away. "I was," he said. Isabel frowned. "What happened?" Edmund could not hide from the answer. "I forgot what mattered." Eleanor looked away. Edmund rose. "I am sorry." He said it again, not as a duke accustomed to apology being accepted, but as a man finally admitting that regret was the only thing he could offer freely. "I blamed you for Arthur's death," he continued. "I was wrong. You did everything possible for him. I let grief make me cruel, and I listened to someone who wanted me to believe you were weak." Eleanor's eyes filled, but she did not cry. He wanted to reach for her, but he knew he had forfeited that right years ago, and he would not steal it. "You cannot undo it." "No. You cannot give me those years back." "No. And you cannot become Arthur's father again." Edmund's voice broke. "No." Silence settled over the garden. Then Eleanor said, "But you can decide what kind of man you are from this day forward." Edmund looked at her. He glanced toward Isabel and Thomas. "I want to know them. You may have to earn that." "I will." Thomas studied him. "Will you come back?" Edmund looked at the boy, then at Isabel. "If your mother allows me." Eleanor's expression softened almost imperceptibly. Edmund turned toward her. He had come searching for a daughter. Instead, he had found the family he had once thrown away. And as Isabel slipped her hand into Eleanor's, Edmund realized that the hardest part of his journey had not been finding them. It would be learning how to stay. Edmund did not ask Eleanor to return to Hawthorne House. He had spent his life believing that what belonged to Hawthorne could be summoned by a signature or the weight of a title. But standing before Eleanor in the garden, he understood that love could not be reclaimed as property. So he began with something smaller. He came the following morning without a carriage, servants, or gifts. He brought books for Isabel and a wooden puzzle for Thomas. "You remembered his name?" Eleanor said. "I remembered both of them." Thomas accepted the puzzle cautiously. Isabel opened her book and smiled. Edmund felt an ache at the sight. Yet he would not demand that children love a stranger simply because he shared their blood. At first, Eleanor remained guarded. She watched every gesture, listening for the arrogance that had once ruled their marriage. Edmund did not ask about the past. He carried firewood, repaired the garden gate, and sat patiently while Thomas explained a game whose rules changed whenever Thomas began losing. With Isabel he was gentler still. Did he really live in a castle? Was it true that he owned hundreds of horses? Could she see the library? Edmund answered honestly. Yes, 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 though the library is less interesting than people think. She considered that. Mama's books are better. Edmund laughed. I believe you. Eleanor heard him and looked through the kitchen window. For the first time she saw no duke standing there. Only a father learning how to become one. Weeks became months. Edmund began correcting the record publicly. He told every relative who repeated the old story that Eleanor had never neglected Arthur. He spoke of her devotion and admitted that his grief had made him cruel. When one aristocratic woman hinted that Eleanor had abandoned her duties, Edmund's voice turned cold. No, I abandoned mine. Eleanor heard the words from a servant and sat quietly afterward. One evening, Edmund came to the cottage without a gift. I need to ask you something. Eleanor set aside her sewing. What is it? Would you allow me to be part of their lives? You already are. I mean properly. She studied him. I will not have Isabel treated as an heir before she is treated as a child. She won't be. Thomas stays. Of course. You will not remove them from this home. I won't. You will never use your title to overrule me. Edmund nodded. I won't. Her eyes softened. And you will not ask me to forget Arthur. His answer came immediately. Never. Silence stretched between them. Then Edmund removed a small key from his coat. Eleanor recognized it. The cottage key. The same key he had given her on their wedding night. I thought you lost it, she whispered. I kept mine. He placed it on the table. I want you to keep this one too. Not because I gave you the cottage once, but because I want you to know it has always been yours. Eleanor touched the metal. You cannot repair everything with a key. I know. Good. He smiled faintly. I am learning. That was the moment something changed. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But possibility, fragile and bright, took root between them. Spring returned to the garden. Isabel began calling Edmund Papa. She had been running toward him with a torn ribbon. Papa, look. Edmund knelt and opened his arms. Isabel threw herself against him. Eleanor watched from the doorway, tears shining in her eyes. Thomas pretended not to notice. Later he quietly asked Edmund whether dukes were allowed to lose at chess. Apparently this one is. Thomas grinned. Their laughter carried through the cottage. Months later, Edmund stood before Eleanor beneath the old oak tree. I thought I knew what I wanted, he said. You wanted a dynasty. I wanted something I could control. And now, he looked toward the children. Now I want something I can love. Eleanor's eyes filled. He stepped closer but stopped before touching her. If I had to earn your trust one day at a time, would you let me try? She looked at the man he had become. Humbled, honest, and willing to prove that his change was more than remorse. Eleanor placed her hand in his. One day at a time. His fingers closed gently around hers, with the care of a man handling something precious he had once nearly destroyed. That summer they remained in the cottage. Edmund divided his time between the estate and the family he had nearly lost. He learned to value muddy boots over polished floors, children's laughter over formal dinners, and quiet evenings beside Eleanor over every glittering ballroom in England. Years later the garden was brighter. Isabel chased Thomas between the rose bushes, laughing as they raced toward sunset. Edmund stood beside Eleanor watching them. He took her hand. Do you remember what I said? Eleanor smiled. Unfortunately, you cannot raise one child. She looked at the two children. No, she said softly. I remember. Edmund's eyes filled with regret. I was wrong. You were. He turned toward her. You didn't merely raise two children. You taught me what a family was. Eleanor leaned against him. And you finally learned. Behind them, Isabel called for Papa. Thomas shouted that dinner was ready. Edmund laughed and pulled Eleanor closer. The garden glowed beneath the evening sky, the cottage windows warm with golden light. Once, Edmund had believed losing an heir was his greatest tragedy. Now he knew better. His greatest tragedy had been almost losing the woman who taught him how to love, the daughter he never knew, and the boy who taught him that family could be chosen. And his greatest blessing was that after all the years he had wasted, they had allowed him to come home again together.